The Gospel of John can't be trusted historically. It's an anonymous, late treatise that contains all kinds of legendary embellishments at worst. At best, it contains paraphrases that really can't be linked to Jesus' own words or actions. My guest, Dr. Lydia McGrew, says, not so fast, and argues in her book, Eye of the Beholder, that John's Gospel is rife with historically reliable details about the life and teachings of Jesus. She's joining us on All Rise. One thing you're going to notice is that Lydia is lying down. She's not lying down on the job. She's not overly relaxed, although I tend to be a pretty relaxing interviewer. I think the reason she is lying down in the position she is in is because she has chronic pain, a pretty serious pain condition, and that's the most comfortable position she can find in order to concentrate on the interview. So don't give it a second thought as you watch her. In fact, as this goes on, you won't really even notice. But you will notice it first. So that's why she's lying down. It's because that's the most comfortable position for her, given her pain level. All right, so on with the interview. All rise, ladies and gentlemen of the jury. We're talking today with Dr. Lydia McGrew about her book, Eye of the Beholder, The Gospel of John as Historical Reportage. If you aren't already, please do subscribe by clicking the button below, and if you're listening to the audio version, you can subscribe on the appropriate button on whatever app you happen to be listening to. And please do like and share the video or podcast if you like this content. Also, we'd love a review. Every review helps spread the word about All Rise and the content we provide. Dr. Lydia McGrew is a widely published analytical philosopher and author. She received her PhD in English from Vanderbilt University in 1995. She's published extensively in the theory of knowledge, specializing in formal epistemology and its application to the evaluation of testimony and of the philosophy of religion. She defends the reliability of the Gospels and Acts in 4 books, including, what we're talking about today, Eye of the Beholder, The Gospel of John as Historical Reportage, and Testimonies to the Truth, Why You Can Trust the Gospels. Dr. McGrew, Lydia, it's great to have you on. Thanks for being on.
Thank you for having me, Abdu. It's great to be here.
It's wonderful to have you. You've actually written not just these 4 books, but you are quite a prolific author, both on your Facebook groups and Substack and all these kind of things. So give us a snapshot of where people can find more information about you. And we'll put all the links, by the way, in the description or the show notes.
Sure, absolutely. So I have an author page on Facebook, Lydia McGrew Author. You can get, I would say, any Facebook content that I put up about the Gospels, I'm going to put on Lydia McGrew Author. So you don't have to friend request me in order to get that information. But I also have a YouTube channel. It's just Lydia McGrew. And my tag there is Making Common Sense Rigorous. So that's my theme on the Lydia McGrew YouTube channel. And we really delve into some detailed stuff in New Testament studies there. And then that audio content is ported over to your favorite audio podcasts, Spotify or Apple or whatever, just as the Lydia McGrew podcast. And Eric Manning of the Testify channel helps me with that, so thanks to him for that. Those are 3 great places where you can keep up on what I'm doing that's new. And then I'll post, this link to that, and so we'll have references back and forth. There's also an author page on Amazon where you can see the list of all of my books there as well.
Terrific. Well, we'll get all of that stuff to the extent that we can linked in, again, the show notes and or the description, depending on the medium you're listening to this on. So I really want to get into this topic and this book in particular. And the topic is of particular importance to me for a couple of reasons. First, when I was not a Christian, when I was a Muslim, and a skeptic of Christianity, oftentimes people would bring up to me the Gospel of John as proof, of Jesus' claims to divinity, because they seem to be the most obvious. Which, as you and I both know, there's actually quite a few quite obvious claims to divinity in Matthew, Mark, and Luke as well as other parts of the Bible. But I often would dismiss the Gospel of John, and I'd say, well, wait a minute, hold on. Do you even know how late the Gospel of John was written, that it's an anonymous gospel at best, that we don't even know if the disciple had anything to do with it. And it's anonymous. Not only is it anonymous, but it's also got all this historical legendary embellishment. And it's not even a historical book. It's a theological treatise concocted by the church years later to basically sort of elevate Jesus to an unprecedented status that he didn't really deserve. That's number one. But the second thing is, as an evangelist, now someone who actually does believe in Jesus as my Savior, I've often directed the skeptic when I've done open forums, when I've done debates. In fact, I had the privilege of doing a debate at Western Michigan University some years ago with John Loftus, where your quite brilliant daughter Bethel was there and asked a question during the Q&A. I often direct people to the Gospel of John first, skeptics there first, to get a really good picture of who Jesus actually is, not just as I'd like him to be, but as he actually historically is, and get an understanding of him there. So for those two bookends, my initial skepticism and then my eager promotion of the Gospel of John as a historical record of who Jesus really is and what he taught, that's why I am so fascinated to get into this book, Eye of the Beholder, the Gospel of John as historical reportage. And you make a great case for why we should take the Gospel of John seriously, historically, not just theologically. So the subtitle includes the fancy term, reportage. What are we talking about when we say that?
Right. So I coined that word, but it really doesn't mean anything that unusual. But I try to define it pretty precisely. So I usually put it this way in brief. The gospel author is always trying to get it right historically, and he is highly successful. Okay, now he could be, always successful. That's what an inerrantist would say. Obviously, always is compatible with highly, right? It's just the ultimate case of highly. He could be highly successful even if he does make an occasional good faith error. But any such thing is unintentional. His intention is to present himself as historical, and never to deliberately alter facts. So those are my two sort of pegs to hang reportage on. He is always intending to get it right historically, and he is highly successful at doing so.
So let me go into something, because we have to make some establishment on some things with regard to what does it mean for it to be an historical reportage. And it's the Gospel of John, after all. Now, Derek Caldwell and I, my colleague, have done a couple of episodes on the so-called anonymity of the gospel authorship. And so folks can look there for our discussion on how the Gospels aren't really all that anonymous. It's just people keep saying that, and so other people keep saying it. But there's good reasons to believe we know who the actual authors are. Can you give me like a snapshot version of why you think the Gospel of John isn't an anonymous gospel?
So one thing that's important to realize here is that Bart Ehrman will toggle back and forth between two meanings of the word anonymous. And I don't feel that this is very honest of Ehrman. One meaning of the word anonymous is simply that the author doesn't literally give his own name in the gospel, like, my name is John, the son of Zebedee, or something like that.
Right.
And, Bart will say, well, of course it's anonymous. It's a technical term. This is how scholars use the term. But then he'll toggle over to implying very strongly that nobody knew who wrote it. And those aren't the same thing. I mean, if you tore off the front cover of my book and you tore out the, cover page and the endorsements, right? How often in the actual text of the book do I go, I, Lydia McGrew, say this? You could say that a modern book is anonymous in that sense. And yet, obviously, that doesn't mean that nobody knows who wrote it. So I just want to point that out right there, that ambiguity on the word. I think that we can say that the gospel's definitely not anonymous in that interesting sense. First of all, because of all the gospels, this author actually emphasizes who he is, that he was this eyewitness. So in John 19, that he was literally at the foot of the cross. And then at the very end, there's this bit where either he concerning himself or maybe in like 2 verses, someone else concerning him says, yeah, that guy, the disciple whom Jesus loved, is the one who wrote this gospel. And that word right there, as Richard Balcom argues very well, it doesn't mean he had some like connection, very remote connection with it. It might mean that he dictated it to a scribe, but that's the most remote it's going to get. He was known as to who wrote it. But then also the external evidence concerning the authorship is very decisive. It's unanimous. If this were not a biblical book, it would be unhesitatingly accepted that this was written by a man named John. He was Jesus' disciple. He was close to him, etc., etc. Further in the book, I get into this difference. Was it John, the beloved disciple, who was not the son of Zebedee, or John, the beloved disciple, who was the son of Zebedee? And I get into the weeds on some of that. Mm-hmm. But right now I'm just emphasizing, no, it wasn't anonymous. It was known from earliest time. Even at the time of Justin Martyr, super early, he calls all 4 of the Gospels the memoirs of the apostles and their companions.
Mm-hmm. Well, that gets into the dating issue, too, because not only do we have, because oftentimes it's cited as being this possibly 2nd century, maybe mid to late 2nd century writing at best. But you just given at least one reason why we think that this is actually quite early. Anything else you want to say about that?
Sure. Well, Justin Martyr actually quotes a verse from John 3, and it's unique. It's where Jesus is talking to Nicodemus about being born of the Spirit. Mm-hmm. And there's just no way it could be anything else. I mean, if you try to quibble with it, but the wording is so close. It's very clear. And he's so early 2nd century. So it's got to precede that.
Yeah.
And it can't be any later than that. There's also a textual issue I don't want to go too far into, but where a fragment was discovered far away, and it takes time. If the gospel originated in Ephesus, as plausibly it did, then, that has to travel for a fragment to be discovered in Egypt. So those are some additional sort of external reasons to regard it as early. Then there are all kinds of internal reasons of knowledge that the author has of Jewish customs and so forth that ceased at the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70. So those are just some of the many reasons.
Yeah, that's great. Well, I appreciate that. One of the things that I find unique about Eye of the Beholder, there's lots of books on the Gospel of John. You don't need me to tell you. You've read them because that's the research for this book. But our viewers are familiar, likely, or our listeners are familiar, likely, with quite a few books on the Gospel of John. There's a couple of things that are unique about the way you approach this, though, and there's an important distinction I'd like you to expound upon a little bit more, is the difference between, when it comes to the reportage, the historical, what the person is trying to do. You make a distinction between something that's achronological and dyschronological. And this is an important distinction. I'd like you to go a little bit further with this because it really does matter how we view the text from a skeptical standpoint or just from a scholarly standpoint, is saying, what is it actually trying to convey? So give us that difference between achronological and dyschronological.
Sure. So sometimes you'll hear a generalization. Ancient people didn't care too much about narrating chronologically, or they didn't always narrate chronologically. Well, in one sense, we don't always narrate chronologically. So if I tell you about things I did on my vacation last week, I did this, I did this, I did this. I'm not necessarily saying that I did them in that exact order. Mm-hmm. That would be an example of achronological narration, is that I'm not intending to convey to you the order in which it occurred. This concerns even the synoptic gospels also, that they might narrate things but not give a connective that said, after that this happened and so forth. Yeah. And it can also concern length. Are we trying to convey exactly how long this took? So some of the claimed contradictions between John and Mark. I was just emailing someone about this yesterday, where he was quoting a skeptic who said that Mark implies that Jesus' entire ministry took no more than a year. And I'm like, where are you finding that in the Gospel of Mark?
Mm-hmm.
It's not anywhere, you know?
Yeah.
Well, Mark uses the word immediately a lot. Yeah, so that concerns the two things on either side of the word immediately. That doesn't mean that Mark is trying to say the entirety of Jesus' ministry only took a short time.
Right.
So this is important because chronological narration then is deliberately trying to make it look like something happened at a different time or took a different length of time from what it actually took. And so it's important to remember that when scholars say John moved the temple cleansing, that's a real common one that you'll hear. John moved the temple cleansing. They mean it chronologically. They mean, John intended to make it look like it happened early in Jesus' ministry when it really happened late in Jesus' ministry. Mm-hmm. Now, I think that there were two temple cleansings, and I don't think that's far-fetched at all. I think that's really plausible. I think it's like, I don't know, protesting an abortion clinic or something, that you might do it on more than one occasion, and it might be the same clinic, and you might be holding a similar sign, but you do it multiple times, right? So I don't think that's a problem. But if you hear somebody say, John moved the temple cleansing, you shouldn't think that this just means he's sort of narrating it out of order, so it's no big deal. It's a bigger deal because the scholar almost certainly means that he did it on purpose to make it look like it happened at a different time. So that's why these need to be confronted and why they're relevant to reliability. Because if a person is deliberately changing the way something happened, then that's a big deal about, whether you can rely on what he's saying, as opposed to his just being kind of imprecise and not intending to imply what order they happened in.
And it's funny because last night I was turned on to a television show. I like murder mysteries, and this is a murder mystery show, and got turned on to this thing. And last night I was really into it, and it was really quite well done. One of the things that was a device of storytelling was to tell things chronologically. And I think this is a great way for some of our maybe listeners and viewers to encapsulate this in their mind, is that some things, you saw this progression of things going on where someone was going to arrest this person for this crime. And as you were watching them go and do this action, there were jumps over to other scenes where it looked like something had happened after or even before the event that was the main part of the story. And what was happening was there was flashbacks and even flash forwards that were happening in the story. You didn't know that at first, but the filmmaker or the producers of the show made it quite clear at some point that these things didn't happen in this order, and we told you this for thematic purposes, but we are quite clear this happened before this. And you're made aware of it, even if it happens all the time in storytelling, where there's a fact, and someone's like, yeah, but you have to know this as a backstory. But every time that happens in good storytelling, you are made aware of the chronological order. So if you're telling it chronologically, you don't intend to tell it chronologically. Again, you're a great illustration of like, this is what I did yesterday. Or if I took my kids somewhere and I said, well, what rides do they ride at the amusement park? Well, they rode these rides. Well, I don't know if that was the order or not. I don't remember. But you don't expect me to remember that. You don't even care. This chronological means that I was intentionally misleading you, whether for good means or bad means or whatever it was. I don't report it accurately, even when I easily could have. And by the way, the order might even matter. So that's a fundamental difference. By the way, just as an aside, I tend to agree with you on the temple cleansing. I sort of feel like the later temple cleansing was like the last straw. This guy's offended us far too many times now, and this last public one was the last humiliation we're going to take, kind of a thing. But and I got to say, honestly, even as a skeptic, when I read the Gospel of John, I never really thought that the order of that was all that bothersome. It just appeared to me that he did. I mean, it just seemed on its face that he did it twice. It didn't bother me. And I was a skeptic.
Right. Well, and also the synoptics mention a lot of other last straws.
Mm-hmm.
So like the parable he told about the vineyard and, the kingdom's going to be taken from you. And it like says right there in the synoptics, after this, they sought to kill him.
Yeah.
Right. So why should we assume it was, any time that Jesus cleansed the temple, by golly, he was doomed and fated to be crucified within a week. So he couldn't have done it early in his ministry, or he would have been crucified right then instead of 3 years later. That doesn't really follow.
Right. Yeah. He easily could have done it twice. I could imagine easily doing it twice, because it's not like this upstart guy who starts this thing off, does this thing, and all of a sudden everyone's like, well, that guy's got to go. Maybe it's much later on, especially after his popularity grows. There's a million reasons why we can talk about why it doesn't have to be moved, as it were. Right. You also talk about paraphrasing, and you point out that this word has sometimes been used in a sort of non-traditional or non-standard, I should say, maybe even a confusing way. When the Gospel of John, the writer does say essentially that if we recorded everything Jesus ever said or did, we'd never stop writing. So clearly he wasn't taking dictation every time Jesus said something. So there are paraphrases to a degree, but explain what you mean by the way in which sometimes the word paraphrase is used non-standard, or maybe even in a sort of misleading way.
Yeah, I mean, this is really important. And what's interesting is that I find that this is more important to evangelical Christians than it sometimes is to a skeptic. So you'll find a skeptic just saying he made it up. Like, they don't care. They're going to just say right out, he made it up. Whereas, that's a delicate thing. If you're a Christian scholar, you don't want to say he made it up, because that's going to really upset people, right? Mm-hmm. Your fellow Christians. So the word paraphrase gets used to mean what is essentially he made it up. So I'll give an example. The I am saying. So, now we're delving into something that's really considered controversial in John. Okay. So before Abraham was I am, for example. If Jesus didn't stand in front of the people in Jerusalem, and I use the term recognizable context. So if you're there, you're going to go, oh, this is, and you can understand the language. This is a place where he did that. And oh boy, here that guy's grabbing a stone to try to stone him, and so forth, right? Mm-hmm. And recognizable content. So recognizable content and context. So that's paraphrasing. So Jesus might have said, before Abraham existed and walked around in Canaan, I am, for I am before all things, or whatever, right? So saying more than what John records, or saying it in slightly different terms. Fine, that's paraphrased, because if you're there, you're going to recognize the content of the context. But now let's suppose that nothing recognizably like that happened, but that the things in, let's say, Mark happened, like where he claims he can forgive sins. Well, okay, but that's up in Galilee. That's not in Jerusalem. And that's not him saying anything about Abraham, right? It's not the same in either content or context. Yeah. Or, he's saying the stones will cry out, or out of the mouth of babes you've perfected praise, which is implicitly a claim to deity in Matthew, because it's quoting Psalm 8. Okay, but that's like a completely different context. That's after the triumphal entry. Again, nothing about Abraham in here. Okay, so that can't, I think, reasonably be called a paraphrase. Like if John reads what's going on in the synoptics and he goes, I'm going to make Jesus say something that means the same thing, but it's more explicit and it's a different scene that didn't really happen. That isn't paraphrase. That's invention. And so there's been a tendency to say that something, by certain scholars, to say that something is paraphrase. This happened in a discussion I had on Justin Brierly's show with Craig Evans, the scholar Craig Evans, where he said, does Lydia believe in paraphrase? I'm like, well, yeah, but that's not what we're talking about here, So I think that could confuse some people, that John paraphrased.
Yeah, I think this is an important thing for us to make sure we, I'm a big fan of terminology, and my profession of old, before I started doing this full time, as a lawyer, required whenever you did something, whether you were writing a brief or you were writing a contract or whatever it was, you had to get your definition straight. In capital terms were made more obvious. You'd have something capitalized, like what the word contract means, or what the word inception date or commencement date. These are always defined, because those become really important terms. and therefore you can't really quibble over what you meant because both parties agreed to what they actually meant. And in common conversation, we don't always do this because we assume that the words we're using have a sort of an unequivocal meaning based on who's talking, and oftentimes they have equivocal meanings. And if we don't get these things right, oftentimes we find ourselves talking past each other, and a little bit of explanation of what we mean by this is really important. Sometimes we have to, for lack of a better word, I don't know if this is the right word or not, but force the issue, I suppose it is, and say, okay, when you say this, what do you mean? Because when I say paraphrase, I mean someone is summarizing what someone actually said. You're saying someone is making up something completely out of whole cloth, even though it's consistent with something they've said, but they haven't actually said it. And those things, I'll tell you, legally speaking, if I were to say in a court of law, well, Your Honor, he's just paraphrasing. Well, he's not paraphrasing, and that would actually be a problem. But because the jury would never take it as, well, he made up a completely different statement, but it's consistent, and that's good enough. People will sort of furl an eyebrow at that kind of a thing. So this is really important because the I am statements of Jesus in the Gospel of John are pretty important statements that I think are historically reliable. And we don't have to resort to, in my view, and again, I don't have the qualifications other people might have, but then again, in my view, I can use my own common sense and my own understanding of these things and say, it seems to me that he's actually saying those things. And if we're inventing a statement, and it's not obviously an allegory, it's not obviously a parable, then that's a problem. And I think that's one of the things too. This is sort of a little off script, but I think this is really important for us to talk about. Sometimes I think what we do is we slip in and out of genre in our biblical interpretation without any warrant for slipping into that genre. So when Jesus says, so there was a man, okay, we now know that there's a parable coming. We know it. It's an introduction of the whole parable. But if you don't have an introduction into the parable and you start using language like it's a parable without any warning whatsoever, and it strongly suggests that this thing actually happened because you're giving dates, you're giving, relative dates, you're giving historical figures' names, and you're giving settings. And one of the things you point out in the book, and we'll get to this in a minute, is the indicia of historical reportage is the vividness of the data or the descriptions. So I think it's important for us to understand when you when you say you're going to go into a parable or some other genre that the Bible has, it usually has some indication pretty stark ahead of time that it's going to do that.
No, I absolutely agree with you. And this is why at the end of my book, I say hoaxer or historical witness, the Johannine dilemma. And so what I mean by this is that if John's gospel is not reportage, it's a hoax. It's not some recognized other genre. But a hoax means you're trying to actually mislead your original audience as well. And so when I talk about these things, sometimes I'll say, look, when we talk about these alleged subgenres, or it looks like this is Jesus is an allegorical figure here or something, nobody is offering you a secret decoder ring at the bottom of the cereal box where, if you slip this on, you become like an ancient person, and then the Gospel of John suddenly becomes color-coded to where, okay, now I realize, he didn't really say, before Abraham was I am, and the original audience would have had they had their decoder ring, right? It's not like that. It would have been just as much of a guess for them because it would have appeared historical to them as well. And that's something that I argue in the book. I think also this strange use of terms can end up strawmanning my reportage view. So, does Lydia believe in paraphrase? Well, what kind of a kookball would I have to be not to believe in paraphrase, right? Mm-hmm. So then that makes this reportage model look super weird and rigid, like I'm saying that they really did have a tape recorder, mm-hmm. and that's not actually what I'm saying. Mm-hmm. But when I talk about legitimate paraphrase, I'm talking about something that's recognizable. So I think that enables me to put forward and defend my own view without accepting that kind of implicit straw man either.
Yeah. I think that's a very important distinction for us to make as far as we have the conversation going forward about what is intended in John's gospel. And by the way, not just John's gospel, by the way, this applies, I've heard people apply it plenty of times to other of the synoptics just as easily.
Absolutely. Yes.
One of the things that I find interesting is we're talking about scholars and sort of the way in which, because one of the things you talk about in the book is the way in which scholars sort of perpetuate their own sort of myths, as it were, whether it's liberal or conservative, whether it's critical or people who are not, quote unquote, critical scholars of the Bible. And we sort of perpetuate certain things where we say them because other people have been saying them. And I don't know what the motives are. I'm not about to get into a psychological sort of guesswork as to what the motives are. But I do think there is some element to that. The anonymity of the Gospels, when I've heard relatively conservative people say, well, the Gospels are largely anonymous. Well, I think we've exploded what that means already. But that's an example. So that follows on to my next question. Then, if scholars of every stripe sort of talk about some of these things as if they are established, my question for you is, how have scholars taken a look at your work and said, hey, what's going on here? Do they agree with it? Do they disagree with it? Do you find a surprising agreement in some areas?
Well, what I found for The Eye of the Beholder, I was really pleased. It got some really cool blurbs, endorsements. Now, of course, I'm not saying that means that everybody who blurbed it agreed with everything in the book. Mm-hmm. A blurb doesn't have to mean that. But I think what it did show was that it was worth taking seriously. So some really important names: Stanley Porter. These are Johannine scholars. Paul Anderson, Mickey Klink. It's Edward Klink, but he goes by Mickey Klink sometimes. Craig Blomberg. So my publisher, DeWard Publishing, went out and approached these people. Sometimes people that I would have said, you're never going to get a blurb from that guy. And Nathan, my publisher, said, well, it doesn't hurt to try. I'll send him an email. And then we did get a blurb. And I think what that really shows, and there were a lot. My endorsements are in a PDF online. You don't have to buy the book to see the endorsements if that's interesting to you. Mm-hmm. And I'll give you the link to the PDF. What that at least shows is that even though I'm coming from an allied field, I'm coming from the field of philosophy, including the philosophy of testimony and probability of testimony. That doesn't mean that when I'm writing this, you can just ignore it. You can just say, she, what does she know? She's out of her league. She's out of her lane. Mm-hmm. She's unqualified, which has been said, because at least these endorsements mean that it's worth taking into account. It's worth taking seriously. And that's why I was invited that fall to speak at an invitation-only session on the Gospel of John at the ETS. So, that was an honor, and I spoke on Johannine, idiom, and unexplained allusions, and some of these other issues there in my half-hour paper. Mm-hmm. So I think it's been good, and I think it is at least set to rest some of these she doesn't know what she's talking about kinds of claims. One other point I wanted to make is that there are 3 chapters in the book on Johannine idiom. Mm-hmm. And I don't think there's any other book out there that I know of that spends that many chapters on it. So that's a bit unique. Mm-hmm. A bit unique. You're not supposed to use unique that way. But anyway.
No, it is or it isn't, right?
Right. It either is or it isn't. And go ahead.
No, I was going to say, if we, I want to take a break for a moment, in a moment here, but in the next couple of minutes, talk about when you say Johannine idiom, what do you mean, and a couple of examples of what you mean by that.
Right. Well, and that's why I have 3 chapters on it, because it means so many different things. Like, it can mean themes, like the theme of testimony or truth or whatever, right? It can mean really nitpicky Greek things, like what connectives are used more in John than in Luke, and what connectives are used in Greek more in Luke than in John, like that kind of really specific stuff. Or it can mean style, like that Jesus seems a little more repetitious in John. Good. So those are and you could see those are all 3 different things, quite different things. And because of that, and because I don't read Greek, and I don't try to hide this, and I don't fluently I can't just sit down and read Greek. I sent those chapters to scholars who do read Greek. And I said, okay, you guys, read these 3 chapters. Tell me if I'm just making some kind of mistake. And one of them, and I won't say his name because he didn't give me permission to say this. He is one of the people who endorsed it. He said to me, I had drunk the Kool-Aid on Johannine idiom. And, I mean, this guy reads Greek. He's a New Testament professor, okay? That Johannine idiom meant that John, to a greater extent than the synoptics, put his own words into Jesus' mouth. And that it's hard to tell when John is talking and Jesus is talking and all of that. And he said, you really showed me basically that's not true. And this guy reads Greek and I don't.
I see. So this is so critical because oftentimes we take sort of the most famous passage in the Bible, John 3:16, and we sort of have this idea, where does John's words end and where does Jesus slip back in? And as you said, the criticism has been, well, that's the problem, isn't it? Is that you can't tell where John's words end and Jesus's begin, or vice versa, and therefore this isn't really historical. This is paraphrase, so to speak. And so what you're saying is that with the 3 chapters in the book, you talk about this, you really sort of do explode this myth and provide the antidote to the Kool-Aid, as it were. Friends, this is a listener and viewer-supported program, whether you're listening on the podcast or you're watching this on YouTube. The only way we can do this is by the support of good friends like you who want to see this kind of content and be able to share it with other people. So if this is content you value, please not only subscribe, not only share the content, not only rate the podcast, but do consider giving a donation. You can do this in the U.S. and Canada. You can go to our website, embracethetruth.org. There's some buttons there that help you to find ways to give to us. And the link is in the description as well. So we thank you for your support. God bless. Welcome back, friends. As you already know, we're talking with Dr. Lydia McGrew about her book, Eye of the Beholder, The Gospel of John as Historical Reportage, where we've been exploding some myths. When I say we, I mean she has, and I've just been listening to some exploding some myths about the lack of historicity in the Gospel of John and why it's just as reliable a source of history as the Gospels. And those are already pretty darn reliable for a number of reasons. But Lydia, I got I'm looking at my thing right here. I got a million questions to ask you. I can't, which is why we wrote why you wrote a whole book about it, and I'm happy to promote it. About all the details and all the facts. I do want to go into a couple of things again to not only wet some whistles here for getting the book, but really to dive into some depth here on the Gospel of John. So one thing you talk about, and again, this is on method really, and then we're going to get into some specifics, some of the unusual indicia of historicity that are in the Gospel of John in a minute here. But one thing you talk about, and you used some words a second ago that I want to make sure you explain, but I want to talk before I get to that. And those words, by the way, as a preview, were unexplained allusions. And you do talk about one of my favorite topics, which is undesigned coincidences, which I think are great indications of eyewitness testimony, especially from multiple angles, that are very analogous to the way witnesses actually testify in court. And a lawyer would summarize the credibility of multiple eyewitness testimony by saying that they were complementary, not inconsistent, even though they come from different points of view, because one would highlight a fact that the other one would miss, but then that other one's testimony actually makes sense in light of the fact that the other one missed, as sort of a summary. So I want to get into those terms specifically, but you talk about the danger of a passage-by-passage approach to historicity, and how if we try to take each passage and say, is this particular passage historically reliable, and we don't have evidence of that particular passage's historical reliability, well, then we could say it's non-historical or ahistorical or even unhistorical. And you talk about why that's dangerous. Please explain for us.
Sure. And there's even another attitude one can take, which is we must then be agnostic about whether it's historical, right? And so, I see that sometimes people will say, well, you shouldn't be negative. You shouldn't automatically say it's non-historical, but we can't have any confidence that it is. So I think that this is dangerous because it's bad epistemology. And what that's like my specialty.
This is your field, so go for it.
It's my field, And so an analogy I will make will be to a person you know. And I don't think that's even just an analogy. When I was doing this book, I really felt like I was getting to know the author of the Gospel of John as a person by investigating what he did and what he said and how carefully he explained things. So if you know a person, then you don't have to have somebody come along and confirm every separate thing that he says in order for his testimony to count as strong evidence that it happened. Now, you might question it in a specific case. Even if my husband came home and said, I just saw an elephant flying, I might wonder, are you pulling my leg? What's going on here, etc.
Right.
So it's not like it's indefeasible. But if my husband comes home and says, I just saw a terrible car accident, I'm not going to go, well, can you bring anyone else to tell me that there was this terrible car? Because if not, I'm just going to have to be agnostic about it, right?
Right.
No, I have holistic evidence that my husband as a person is a reliable witness. And so then therefore, his testimony by itself has a very strong evidential force. Not necessarily indefeasible, but strong.
Right.
And so in the same way, we ought to be able to approach the Gospels. And we ought to be able to say, okay, here's this author. We find him saying this and we confirm it. We find him saying this and we confirm it, and so forth. At a minimum, this ought to mean that when this author tells us something against which there isn't any reason, so let's suppose it's like not even a miracle. It doesn't even have that higher burden of proof. It's just reporting something Jesus said, for example. And it's certainly not something that's denied in any other gospel or whatever. Then, that ought to be good reason because we know that he's holistically reliable. So if Jesus is reported in John as saying, I'm the way, the truth, and the life, no man comes to the Father but by me, for a guy to stand there and say that, why not? He could have said that. And so then when we have all this other information that shows us that John is close to the facts, that he's scrupulous, he doesn't make stuff up, and so forth, that ought to be a good reason to accept it. And even if it is reporting a miracle, the way I usually put this is, if you've got good evidence that this is a reliable source, then that should be at least taken to be what people close to the matter claimed happened. So it's not like it's made up by a telephone game process like what Bart Ehrman says.
Right.
Instead, it's what someone actually claimed, and then we say, well, could somebody have been mistaken about that or whatever, but at least it gets us back close to the events. So that, I think, is a reasonable historical approach to reliability as opposed to uniting what I might call secular or objective reason to this passage by passage approach. And here's what I mean. I'm not saying this as a Christian. When I say I think John is historically reliable, I'm not saying that because, I believe that the Holy Spirit inspired it or because I believe in Jesus or whatever. I'm saying that because that seems to be the direction that the evidence points. So I don't have to say, oh man, I'm lacking an objective historical argument that Jesus said that because I don't have a separate evidence for just that exact saying or just that exact incident. If that's the approach that historical Jesus scholars take, they're wrong. And they're wrong not because, it offends me religiously, but because it's poor epistemology and it's a poor way to approach history.
It's interesting you say this because this is another aside on my own sort of experiences. As a skeptic, I'm reading the Gospel of John, and I already had this frame of mind from the things that I had read, the things that I had been told by the skeptics, because I actually didn't want the Gospel of John to be true because it would have actually upended a lot of my worldview. But as I was reading it, and especially, this is interesting, especially during law school and right after law school, I began to see, I didn't put the words that you just put to it in the exact same way, but as I understood more and more eyewitness testimony and how it actually works, and the way in which people actually do believe eyewitness testimony, justifiably believe eyewitness testimony, even when there is no real, there's no corroborating nor disconfirming evidence of it. It's just completely consistent, and why you have a reason to doubt it unless there's a good reason to doubt it. And then augmented by my years of experience as a trial lawyer, you begin to see that exactly what you're saying, you're giving intellectual rigor and academic rigor to something that I think is just frankly common sense. And it's a justifiable reason to say, this approach sort of is counterintuitive. People often have. It's like, well, if there's no corroborative evidence, then you can be agnostic about it, or you can, be negative about it. And I'll tell you, one of the things that as a lawyer you prize, especially as a litigator, is that the times when you walk into court and you're at a hearing or whatever it might be, and you don't have the full record in front of you, because you rarely ever have the full record. You have a good record, but not always a full record. Sometimes the facts remain unknown as the case progresses, even during a trial. And you present something in an argument to the judge, and your opposing counsel says something along the lines of, well, Mr. Murray is playing fast and loose or being disingenuous or whatever words might be euphemisms for lying. What you wait for is the judge who you've been in front of plenty of times, or judges plural, to say these kind of things. And lawyers get this all the time, is for a judge to say, if this is the first time, if Mr. Murray is lying, or if thus and such is lying, this is the first I've ever heard of it. He has never done this before. He has been honest when the record is not complete. He has been honest when it's wrong. And if he's been mistaken, he's obviously reported it as mistaken, and he's done so. Every lawyer prizes that. And I can tell you, I got that one time, and it was one of the highest compliments. And it essentially is, what you're saying is that I don't have to have corroborating evidence other than my understanding of who this person actually is. Now, could I be mistaken? Sure. And again, it's not indefeasible. But it's just a common way to look at things, and you don't have to go and be all skeptical about everything. And so I think what you've done is given us something of a not only just our common sense, but our common sense is backed up by really good reasons to go through this kind of a thing in your book. So I appreciate that. A couple of terms, unexplained allusion. I'd love you to explain that if you could, about what you mean by that and how it applies to the case for the historicity of John.
So an unexplained allusion is something that comes up in ordinary people's speech, where the person forgets his audience, in a sense, for a moment, because he's so involved in what he's saying. Mm-hmm. So a made-up example would be if I said something about, I'm telling a story, and then a real story, and then I say something about, of course, that week was a kind of a scary week in Kalamazoo, and then I move on, and I'm forgetting that the person doesn't know that we had a tornado in Kalamazoo here last week. Mm-hmm. Okay, so I don't have my eye on my audience at every moment. Mm-hmm. It's a mark of authenticity, because I'm not thinking of myself as a storyteller, mm-hmm. right, who's trying to make a certain impression. Mm-hmm. And we find this in the Gospel of John. In fact, I find more of these in the Gospel of John than in any other gospel. This gives what I call the texture of testimony. And that's what you were talking about just a moment ago. Sometimes we almost feel like we don't know how to make it explicit. And I'm trying a little more to make it explicit. Mm-hmm. So an example in John would be where he's talking about the miracle at Cana. Okay, we finished the miracle at Cana, water into wine, and then he hasn't quite started yet the story of the temple cleansing there in John 2. And right in between there, there's this little verse that says, after this, Jesus and his mother and his brothers and his disciples went down to Capernaum, and they stayed there for a few days. End. Mm-hmm. Now it was the time of the Passover, blah, 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 and we're off into the next story. That's just weird, mm-hmm. okay? If this is a highly edited, highly curated, polished story, even to just try to make it flow better, I mean, even if it were all factual, but
Yeah.
even if you were really trying to make it flow better, you would cut that out.
Mhm.
It's pointless.
Mhm.
And we never get an explanation. Like, why did they go to Capernaum? Was this on their way to the Passover? It doesn't actually indicate that. Why'd they stay there for a few days? Etc. Oh, it looks like he and his mother and brothers were all friends at this point. You know, sometimes they're not in the other Gospels, but it's pointless. And that's the kind of thing you sit down with a military veteran or a person and you just kind of get him talking. And you'll get those. You will find those where he'll say these things and you have to kind of stop him and go, wait a minute, why? Or what did you mean by that? Or whatever. And maybe he didn't feel like going into a digression, but he just said it because it happened to occur to him. And we get several of those in John, and it's a really cool internal mark of testimony.
Yeah. That is pretty cool. So you also talk about some vivid detail. So we got a few minutes. Talk about some of the vivid. Give a couple of examples of some of the vividness of the reporting in the Gospel of John.
Well, he loves to write scenes, but it's not something that he could be copying from other literature at the time, because the literature at the time is not particularly vivid like this. So when we're at the tomb of Lazarus, when you read it in a English translation, it says something like Jesus was moved in spirit. But when you read some commentaries, they point out that the word there is like a horse snorting. So it's like, she's like, he's like growling almost, and we don't even necessarily know why. Was he angry at the devil for death or, at the people for unbelief or whatever? But it's extremely vivid. Or, of course, I don't think John was there when Mary Magdalene met Jesus at the tomb, but I think he probably got the story directly from Mary Magdalene. Notice how many times it mentions that she turned. It mentions it several times. Her physical motion. John is the author of physical motion. So she bends down and she kind of looks in the tomb, and then Jesus speaks to her. He's like behind her, and she turns, right? And then she must have turned back, even though it doesn't say it. But then it says she turned to him, like again. So you can almost picture Mary Magdalene telling this story, like you see me, totally. I can't talk without my hands, right? So, like Mary Magdalene's like, so I look at the tomb and I see these men in white and they say this to me, and then I hear this voice behind me and I turn and I said that, and then I turned back, etc. And John is remembering all of this. Or one more, when Judas Iscariot goes out and Jesus says, what you do quickly, and out he goes, and it says, and it was night. Okay? It looks like there were not probably windows in the room. And so when he goes out, he opens the door, and as one author has put it, one oblong of darkness stamped itself upon one mind forever. And that John sees that, and out Judas goes, and that's the last time he ever sees it. Man. So those are just a few of those wonderfully vivid details that we find.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah, it just, the vividness with which he describes a scene, I think would help to explain the vividness with which he actually uses Jesus' words to mean the things that he means, in the clarity with which he means them. And oftentimes, it's not that John is being more theologically clear or expansive than the other Gospels, but there is a vividness to it. And sometimes he's actually not more clear. There's a couple of things like, oh, well, what does that mean exactly? So if it was this curated thing that was meant to sort of expound where the other Gospels were sort of deficient in some sense, you'd expect a little bit more of that. But that's terrific. One of the things that you also address is the idea that John seems to be more theological than the other Gospels. And which makes it more of a literary thing as opposed to a historical account. And you deal with it. So give us a snapshot of how you deal with it. Then I want to sort of wrap up on a conversation. I could keep going and going and going on. I'm very tempted. I'm looking at the timer now, and I'm like, oh my goodness, are you kidding already? So if you could just give us sort of a response to that, that'd be great.
Sure. So a phrase that I use that I'd like to stick in people's minds is that in John's mind, fake points don't make points. So when John talks about Jesus' bones not being broken, that, they come to the men on the cross and they break the legs of the first thief and the second thief, but Jesus is dead already, so they don't break his legs. Instead, they stab him in the side, right? And out comes blood and water, very graphic, kind of traumatic, icky detail that he gives. And then he pauses and he says that this is that the scripture might be fulfilled, that not a bone of him will be broken, and they have looked upon him whom they have pierced. John doesn't think that could fulfill scripture unless it really happened. So that passionate advocacy of the theological significance of Jesus' side being pierced is inextricably connected in John's mind with its empirical reality. That he's standing there and he actually sees the blood and water come out, and then that's why he can say, yes, this fulfilled, not a bone of him shall be broken. So I think that's how John thinks about it, that he's not going to try to tell us, hey, Jesus raised Lazarus from the dead because he's the resurrection and the life, and you should think of him as the resurrection and the life, even though I really know that he didn't really raise Lazarus from the dead, right? No, it's because he really did raise Lazarus from the dead. So for John, fake points don't make points. And I think he makes that quite clear and explicit there in John 19.
That's terrific. Wow. By the way, that could be a political slogan as well as fake points don't make points. That's terrific. Fake points don't make points. I wrote it down. I started and I circled it. And it's important for us to remember. Lydia, time has run out far too quickly. Thank you so much for the time. Thank you for the book. It's a terrific resource. Friends, the book is Eye of the Beholder, the Gospel of John as Historical Reportage. If you've ever wondered and asked yourself, what is different about this gospel? The answer is there are some differences there. There are some reasons why it's different from a different perspective in terms of how John writes. But that doesn't mean it's not historical. In fact, the differences are indicia that it is, in fact, is historical, and it provides us a fuller, broader picture with its inclusion amongst the four Gospels than without it. And this is the wonderful camera lens from which Mark, Luke, Peter, obviously, and others saw of Jesus, and the author of the Gospel of John saw him as well. This was a big sticking point for me for a long time, that this book can't be trusted. It's a theological invention. It's a legendary embellishment. And I came to see through my own journey that it is nothing of the kind. This book by Lydia McGrew is a book that will give you even more reasons than I had to think that it is historically reliable, and it gives you a beautiful picture, a vivid picture, high definition, as Lydia's put it in her book, a high definition view of who Jesus actually is. So I stand by it. Whenever I do an open forum, I say, friend, if you're a skeptic, if you're thinking about whether or not this God is real, I would urge you to read the Gospel of John and then ask, is Jesus who this book says he is? And then read it again. You will be all the richer for having done so. So, Lydia, thanks again for your time. It's been a pleasure to have you on. And friends, until the next time, defense rests.